welcome to you all. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks so much, Dorota and Eglė. So just quickly introduce you. You will be now doing a lecture performance, Vaporized, Dispersed, Made Particular. And yeah, Dorota Gawęda and Eglė Kulbokaitė are an artist duo based in Basel. They both are graduates of the Royal College of Art in London. And they work really in quite a variety of media, so video, performance, installation, also fragrance, which is very exciting, and sculpture. And in their work, they address feminist-inspired theory and fiction, technology-driven emancipation. And they also have founders of the Young Girl Reading Group. With that project, they really examine the relationship between reading and affect, togetherness and disunity and bodily and virtual presence, and also how language can become material and embodied really. And in 2020, they were actually shortlisted for the Swiss Art Awards and Swiss Performance Prize, and the duo is represented by Amanda Wilkinson Gallery in London and also by the Lucas Hirsch Gallery in Düsseldorf. And so now just quickly about the performance. I mean, you might have already read the little blurb, but it'll be a 45 minutes around, and then there will be a short Q&A after. And here we will look at the landscape as a site of speculation, and it will look at the natural and the synthetic, and also observe Gothic social metaphors, and try to reintroduce also, just folkloric narratives into this technological digital present that we find ourselves in. And we will also have an insight in their recent works, Mouseless, and also what they've been doing in the recent residency at the Al Serkal Foundation in Dubai, where they just recently arrived back from. And I think they will also give us some insight into their work with fragrance and the underlying molecular entanglements between the subject and their surrounding, and in general, more generally also this idea of dissolving subject and object, which I'm very excited for. I just want to already let you know that you will have the chance to ask questions after, so you can even just already drop your questions when they come up in the chat. So I can read all the questions that are there, and also, of course, you are welcome to speak up later. And now I just wish you a good time. And you have the word, Eglė and Dorota.
Okay. We begin.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Karina. Thank you all for coming. Can I start?
The lower bound of a landscape is constituted by the earth. Under the same field at which I find myself looking lies the sullen but sustaining earth, a vast layer of materiality composed of soil, stone, and rock that is, in its own way, as capacious as the sky. But where the sky is eminently visible, and the horizon coyly demi-visible, the earth withdraws from sight at every remove. Only the outer surface of the topsoil gives itself to me as a manifest presence. It takes rare glimpses of its upturned depths, excavated earth, cliffs striated with sedimentary deposits, to sense what lies below the surface.
The smell of wet soil is known to stimulate a visceral response in people. The odor derived from oils exuded by plants during dry periods is absorbed by clay-based soils and rocks. During rain, the oil is released into the air, along with another compound called geosmin, a metabolic byproduct of actinobacteria, which is emitted by wet soil producing a distinctive and easily recognizable scent. Petrichor, deriving from Greek with the meaning of a stone liquid which flows in the veins of gods, is the molecular moment of the landscape entering the breathing body. Its release into the air ensues rainfall following a drought. Soil, as the upper layer of the earth, could be compared to skin insofar as it is porous and vulnerable in both directions. A permeable membrane that consists of a mixture of clay, rock particles, organic remains of plants and animals. The soil is also a harbinger of multiple fictions, stories to be retold and futures to be inhabited.
Landscapes are inhabited with a multiplicity of nature spirits, returning, crawling back from beneath the surface, from the earth, chewing onto the contemporary ecological anxieties. Horror, and folk horror in particular, provides us with an ecological worldview in which human and nature, human and non-human, are thoroughly imbricated, always on the verge of becoming other. Horror is a vehicle for understanding how fear develops alongside inside-outside dichotomy and seeks to consider the construction of the heretic, deviant subject, and conversely monstrification and othering of nature as historically intertwined phenomena. Horror is often that which is attributed to being outside, norm, society, which is inherently part of queer experience. Queerness to many is this horror of blurring boundaries, a strange distortion between inside and outside.
Earth is wretched, our ground. All leveled, all vanished, all settled, contaminated, eroded, drained, exploded.
In the narrative of perpetual return played out between the undead body and the landscape, malevolent spirits inhabiting Eastern European bogs, such as Topielet or Rusałka, reveal that the past was never actually past at all. The dead, drowned, burned, buried life, they have always lived in the spill, in the landscape, and in the folk horror. Many of the Slavic and Baltic nature spirits are often believed to dwell in the natural terrestrial boundaries, especially those delineating the threshold between the human and the natural, field borders, gullies, forest edges, swamps, whirlpools. In fact, the 17th and 18th century Russian historical records that describe both demons and spirits of vernacular belief who lived in the liminalities of nature placed a special ban on prayers performed to demons near wells, rivers, and copses, near barns, washing houses, and other transitional places.
Rise from the depths
What legs only can I use to lift myself? Huh? What arms to lean up on? Make your fingernails into spades, your hands into shovels, throw the soil onto one side and the sled to the other. Turn your hands into shovels. Take yourself out. Return to me.
Bram Stoker's Dracula, despite operating in Victorian London, sleeps in crates of soil brought from his native Romania. This soil dust follows the vampire and settles in the spaces he inhabits. It is advised to sterilize the Romanian soil in order to disinfect the place of vampiric refuge and the source of their primal power. The Malleus Maleficarum 1489 treatise on witchcraft, known as the Hammer of the Witches, describes the emergence of a demon or vampire whose body, although arising from air, possesses an earthy quality and a density of soil. Lada and her daughter Lela in Baltic mythology are deities that connect soil and the sky and nurture the earth. Their names up to this day are carried through Lithuanian folk songs sutartinės. Today, the meaning of the word Lelumai, deriving from Lela's name, is still being carried through song as an unconscious chant to the deity.
Thesmophoria began as a fertility rite. It dated back to pre-Homeric times. A ritual women conducted in late autumn when seed was to be sown. Demeter, the goddess of the earth, presided as divine patron. The festival's story came from Demeter's burial and mourning for her dead daughter Persephone. The name came from its main action, that of laying things in the earth. Thesmoi in Greek means laying down, in the broad sense of laying down the law. Women prepared for the Thesmophoria with a ritual act making use of pigs, treated in Greek mythology as animals of sacred value. At the end of each spring, they took slaughtered pigs into the pit or megara, dug in the ground. Here, the dead animals were left to putrefy. On the first of the 3 days of the Thesmophoria, Women went into the pits containing the moist remains of the pigs and mixed grain seed into the carcasses. This day was a matter of going, kathodos, and rising up, anodos. For the women rose from the cave to enter into special huts where they sat and slept on the ground. On the second day, the women fasted to commemorate Persephone's death. They mourned by swearing and cursing. On the third day, they retrieved the grain-rich piglets, and the stinking mush was sown into the earth later as a kind of sacred compost.
In an Eastern European context, it is language that persists as the primary resistance to oppression, specifically through a stubborn clinging to folklore as a counter-network of information. As a type of text, folklore is distinct in that it doesn't belong to any individual or group. It is typically transmitted orally and operates outside of the logics of economic remuneration. It frequently undergoes modification and thus transcends issues of intellectual property, and it is closely linked to the arts, but ultimately stands outside them.
The cult of Marzanna emerged in the year 965 after the newly christened Polish prince Mieszko I ordered the destruction of all pagan idols. The people are said to have gathered the cherished objects and deity representations and were ordered to drown them in nearby lakes and rivers as a mass spectacle. Sacred trees were cut through the land and their severed branches were set ablaze. The people wept and mourned the loss of their kindred spirits. It was said that Marzanna, a powerful demon of death, emerged from the amalgamation of the impaired and drowned spirits. Since medieval times, the people felt the compulsion for reenactment of this violent spectacle, which is carried out annually on spring equinox. Out of straw, which is then wrapped in linen and beautified with ribbons and beads, arises the goddess. She is the demon of death, plague, and winter, whose effigy embodies cyclical death and rebirth. On the afternoon of March 21st, the first day of spring, young children still play with and torture the idol, gleefully parading it around and dunking it in every trough and water barrel in the village or city. At dusk, they gather at the riverbank, setting the effigy ablaze and tossing into the water, cheering as the blazing wretch disappears downstream.
In Eastern European rural tradition, on Thursdays, or most notably on October 31st, the ancestral ghost or Zade would pay the living a visit. In preparation, the bathhouse was heated. The number of chairs, shirts, and towels set in the bathhouse equaled the number of invited souls. After bathing, feasting took place. An equivalent number of table settings was to be laid out. The foods would be dark in color and aromatic. They were to resemble the soil. Even babies were kept awake. The presence of death was immediately announced to all domestic animals. Bees were informed by a rhythmic knock on the hive. Attentiveness was endorsed. Silence ruled the house. Doors and windows remained open. Additional food was left at the crossroads and was handed out to the poorer members of society, as that simultaneously meant a poor person, leaving only little linguistic disjunction between being ancestor or family and being poor.
Signorie of Egremont, Valdermont, burned. Sumie van Rechthalten,
Let me share this story for those of you who have not read it before. Once upon a time there was a child who was willful and who would not do as her mother wished. For this reason, God had no pleasure in her and let her become ill, and no doctor could do her any good. And in a short time she lay on her deathbed. When she had been lowered into a grave and the earth was spread over her, all at once her arm came out again and stretched upwards. And when they had put it in and spread fresh earth over it, it was all to no purpose, for the arm always came out again. Then the mother herself was obliged to go to the grave and strike the arm with a rod. And when she had done that, it was drawn in, and then at last the child had rest beneath the ground. The arm, it came up in a story of violence, the striking arm of the grim story. The arm comes alive after death. The arm is life after death. Before the grim ending, the arm is held up in a moment of suspension. The arm becomes, despite the morbid nature of the story, a signifier of hope. The arm in suspension is still rising. Even after the willful child had been brought down, something, some spark, some kind of energy persists. There is agency where we thought there was none.
Demonology was rooted in medieval Europe and the creation of the social stereotype of the witch, a stereotype that was the keystone of an ideological edifice for political persecution, was developed by the Catholic Church in an epoch marked by great political and social upheaval. Although the stereotype had been elaborated in a narrow local context, once developed, it acquired a life of its own. While the formal theological construct shaped the official rules by which orthodoxy and heresy were to be judged, the stereotype penetrated and became a part of European folk belief, of the popular culture. It became a standard for judgment and a cultural evaluation, which was applied outside the boundaries of the specific context in which it had been conceived. The Spanish conquest of Peru thus transported the devil and his ally, the witch, to the Andes. Confronted with the startlingly different cultures of the New World, the Spanish crown and the Catholic religious authorities began the process of creating institutions that would bind these newly discovered lands to the mother country. An integral part of the colonization process entailed the campaign waged by the Church to destroy indigenous religion. Although the clerics who accompanied the first conquistadors and administrators might have engaged in disputes over the nature of the indigenous soul and over the theological justification of conquest, almost all agreed that the devil was flourishing in the Andes. How else to explain the devotion displayed by these people towards the hills, the trees, the stones, the sun, the moon, rivers, and springs.
Baltic legends tell us about large stones with shallow crannies and foot-shaped crevices in their surface. Rainwater collected in these vessels would attain magical properties. It is almost up until this day. Women coming back home from work will stop by these rocks to wash their hands and faces and to heal from diseases. Amilcar Cabral says, the conflict between lithos, rock, and Atmos, climate, is due to the antagonisms between rock and climate. If we admitted the existence of intention and natural phenomena, we could argue that this opposition demands that the rock transforms itself in order to subsist. Neither the rock disappears completely, nor the climatic phenomena cease to operate. Rather, the rock gets integrated into a new form of negation existence. This observation, intention, and natural phenomena can be read as an urge to allow for a kind of rock agency. The rock soil is carrier of prose, a narrative, the substrate where everything is inscribed. This echoes what is described as a geophysical force. This hierais is what in part we are in our collective existence. It is neither a subject nor an object.
In staying with the trouble, making kin in the Cthulhu scene, Don Harvey thinks through the demon familiar spider, Pimoa Cthulhu, writing, I work with string figures as a theoretical trope, a way to think with, a host of companions in sympathetic threading, felting, tangling, tracking, and sorting. I work with and in SF, that is, science fiction, speculative fabulation, string figures, speculative feminism, science fact so far, as material semiotic composting, as theory in the mud, as muddle. But what if the mud does not stop flowing, leaks in its permanence through all the crevices?
In The Art of Living on a Damaged Planet, Niels Pavon describes the eruption of the Sidoarjo mud volcano, informally called Lucy, that erupted in Indonesia in 2006, shortly after the company PT Lapindo Brandas Incorporation had begun exploratory drilling for gas in the late Miocene stratum 2,800 meters below the surface of the Earth. The toxic mud continues on leaking after the first humanly made volcanic eruption in planetary history.
The 2012 movie Hantu Lumpur Lapindo, The Ghost of the Lapindo Mud, is based on the narrative of these tragic events, an example of film mystique, a popular movie genre that combines soft eroticism with horror stories, featuring the many varieties of spirits and ghosts in the Indonesian mystical universe. Hantu Lumpur Lapindo is the story of a striptease dancer who is murdered by a gang of organ thieves after they have removed her heart. The gang dumps her body in the Lapindo mud, but the ghost rises, smeared in mud, to haunt the gang and kill its members one by one. In the movie, mud is a spiritual index of vengeance against capitalist mark, 'mark, 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 Until recently, the notion that humans could have an impact on the tectonics of the Earth itself was laughable. Not so anymore. Industrially produced tectonics have become an increasingly recognized risk, since fracking and high-pressure injection wells have been shown to generate an increase in earthquake activity.
O rise, Mariola, from the earth, from the dark soil, O Mariola mine. What legs, poor me, can I use to lift myself? Oh, what arms to lean upon? Oh, my soul, my little heart. Oh, make your fingernails into spades, your palms into shovels. Oh, Mariola mine. Oh, throw the soil onto one side and the slab to the other. Oh, Mariola mine. Turn your hands into shovels. Dig yourself out. Return to me. Thus goes the Greek Mariola lament song of longing or xenitia, a sense of catastrophic loss characterized by a frenzied yearning for home. Every year, the people of Epirus in northern Greece hold Panegyria, multi-day music-intensive events in which they mourn their losses and celebrate what remains. Panegyria are religious festivals in that they are tied to the patron saint of the village church and are held on the day dedicated to honoring the life of that saint as determined by the Greek Orthodox calendar. There is speculation that the Panegyria have pagan roots, that the priests simply assimilated them. Regardless, Panegyria have always aimed to treat Xenitia with a hefty dose of Barea, a company of friends. Panegyria are a way for the village to pay homage not just to its saints, but also to its missing, those who left, those who are otherwise exiled, and then to exalt in the remaining togetherness, however fleeting it may be.
At this moment, a process of global mutation was already underway. We were undergoing social and political changes as profound as those that transpired in early modernity. We're still in the throes of the transition from a written to a cyber oral society, from an industrial to an immaterial economy, from a form of disciplinary and architectural control to forms of microprosthetic and media cybernetic control. Colonialism began the biologization of the state we currently live under, a moment when the statistical forms of knowledge are applied in monitoring the population, used in management and the prediction of evolutionary conditions, a period defined by a significant move away from earlier notions of the state grounded in territory. Bodies become expanded territories, lands for sovereign intervention, where the managerial hand has a say about the liability of one's own biorhythms.
Petrichor is the molecular moment of the landscape entering the breathing body. When excited noble gases emerge as photons in a fluorescent lamp, they emerge through the bathroom of whose walls the photons reflect. When a cloud of dusty spores emerges as moldy peach rocks in a forgotten bowl, the dust emerges through the currents of air in the deserted kitchen. When a kettle boils unseen, the steam emerges through the less excited particles in the water on the stove and for the framed photograph on the windowsill, whose glass it coats with a fine layer of mist. Weirdness that inhabits human and non-human bodies as it does the environment imbricates us in complex relations that reveal a mutual desire for co-constitution.
Judith Butler makes a case for queer ecology because she shows how heterosexist gender performance produces a metaphysical manifold that separates inside from outside. The inside-outside manifold is fundamental for thinking the environment as a metaphysical, closed system. Nature. This is impossible to construe without violence.
She looks at the paintings. She looks into them. Every one of them is a picture of Lucy. You can't see her exactly, but she is there. And behind the pink stone island, or the one behind that. In the picture of the cliff, she is hidden by the clutch of fallen rocks towards the bottom. In the one of the river shore, she is crouching beneath an overturned canoe. In the yellow autumn woods, she's behind the tree that cannot be seen because of the other trees, over beside the blue sliver of pond. But if you walked into the picture and found the tree, it would be the wrong one, because the right one is further on.
Yes, illa Pejnava illa belevel ya uliul illul uliul okoch socialiu odod eisbel noglavio staglavi stagiot e Volce benijavas desniova Pestami stendius Belce fila Besnivia illa Belver illa Snogdo, ogiufok, niktagdop, op, eżbiżjal, zewaga, nezlotio, taktitiu, aniewot, plagasam, ebria golevo, obenimatus ella, elimasek dibio, peleve, jagadi, ujdizina, prospel, estigda, ordeniado,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for these stories or these tools really to help us mourn and give us tools to rebuild our relationship to the landscape, which is also a body of the rejected, I guess, but also of the observer that was once distant, but now is melting into it again. So giving us an idea that we are not separate from the landscape. At the moment, is there already a question from the audience? Otherwise, I will go on. So you can raise your hand or also put a question in the chat. Yeah, I was really interested in this dissolution of subject and object, and the way your entire presentation really was very non-hierarchical in thematically, but also formally in the way you were cross reading through the different, through basically stories of repression, but also of resistance, and how they are very intertwined. Yeah, this missing also this concept of point of view actually. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the role of technology or current technology in that, in your work, but also specifically in this dissolution of subject and object, and in which ways it supports that endeavor, but also in which ways it stands in the way. And maybe also just more in general, how do you use it? Maybe you could just start telling about the use of GAN's algorithms and what they are in that work.
I guess like what you see throughout the presentation is like both the landscape and the creatures that are transforming one into another. They're created by GAN, like algorithmic animation. And I guess like we're interested in like this in like two ways. In some ways, like in this kind of artificial intelligence that trying to imagine nature in some way from the pool of imagery, trying to create nature, or like the idea of what it is, but also in a way like of a viewer reading it back again, like trying to reinterpret it within like a certain, I don't know, like a cognitive norms of like what it is and what they're supposed to be seeing. So like I guess like for us this animations is like to show multiple layers of interpretation that constructs like the notion of nature, and I guess like
So it's somehow like the landscape that is created by artificial intelligence is not really much different than the landscape created by an artist who paints landscape. So it's somehow just thinking through the concept of nature as already a technology, and this painting is this framing and mediation of this. So this idea that is also synthetic, like equally artificial to artificial intelligence doing the same thing. So somehow to us it's a parallel. I think that's why we use those images in particular.
Yeah, and even the idea of horror or haunt, this almost, the images have this go really well with also the discussion of horror, I guess, because the idea of horror in your work is also interesting, because it is actually the social metaphors of the monstrous, the witch, these are actually stories of exclusion in a way, but also maybe a fear of control, loss of control, or loss of well, maybe even fear of death, I guess.
Yeah, I guess also like something that is a loss of boundaries, a loss of somehow an outline when you cannot point what it is exactly that you're looking at. And I think that these AI images also have this quality that like ever morphing, and you can never really put them into a kind of clean defined taxonomy. So that's somehow what also makes them monstrous, but also in a similar way, this is also what creates these landscape demons that we're interested in. It's a multiplicity of overlapping stories, and in the end you don't know what this entity is anymore, I think.
And maybe this is a good moment to ask the question of Martina Freya. I would be interested what was the starting point for the project, and how you combined these visuals with these texts.
I guess from the beginning of our collaboration, like text was for us like a very a significant it was always a starting point, because we began our collaboration from young girl reading group, and I think we still like interested in text, and text as a primary source of research.
I guess the presentation is composed of quoted textual material, which is assembled similarly as we would assemble the reading for younger reading group, which is a collection of fragments that is, it's not very kind of hierarchical or consistent in any way. It's just creating a narrative from very separate references, I think. Things that interest us from folk songs, there is at least 3 that we play actually. Some of them are integrated into our work already, some are in their own originals as well. Then there's theory, there's different folk stories. So that's the text material, and all of the images are fragments of our work, which again are kind of assembled into a new narrative. So you can see parts of Mouthless, part 1 film, which we finished last year. You can see shorter video works as well, which is like a lot of the animated material. And then there's also Mouthless part 2, which is, it's not a film that's finished yet, but I guess they're again like interwoven and fragmented, and they create their own narrative, I think.
Yes, and I guess like all this text material that we're reading it's not there in these 2 last video pieces as such, but like it just, I guess, frames our thinking while making these 2 works, like last works of last and this year, basically.
Yeah, and maybe still one last question is your use of smell, because the excerpts also you wrote, they're so visceral in the descriptions, even the idea of the soil and the body, and but then yet we are in a screen or like and then the smell obviously is really missing. But then how did you come to work with smell? Or
I guess that's the one thing we can't share with you right now, but that's also what interests us in smell. It's like this one sense maybe that you really cannot make it digital. You cannot somehow send it. It's really bound to a given place and a given time. So I think that's why we like to work with smell and with fragrance. And in this performance, I think we refer most to the smell of wet soil, which we created last year, and it's something that we often use as an element of works or as a work in its own right. And I think it really interests us because it feels like you kind of thinking through smell maybe allows us to integrate with the thing that the smell is describing, which in this case is the landscape. It's the smell of land, which somehow a lot of people are said to feel very emotional about. So
yeah, and this fragrance we usually like. I mean, when the film like Mouthless Part 1 screened is screened in the space, so we show it with a fragrance at the same time. So I guess like it's just coming from like a performative background for us. This lived experience, live experience is still very much important, and like we're trying to think how like art can be approached also, like not only in like visual sense, but like in more like emotional sense. And like yeah, I think that's why fragrance is quite significant to us.
yeah, and it really also space going into the past, because it's a memory really connected to me. We are now, we have now 5 o'clock. Oh, but there is one more question. Is it okay to have one more question?
Yeah, we try to answer quickly.
Okay.
Think you're okay?
I'm curious what you think, how the motives such as folklore, horror, and blurring of the subject-object boundaries relate to roleplay, LARP. Could we situate your non-hierarchical narrative as a potential form of roleplay?
I guess.
I mean, I think maybe just quickly, definitely, because the reason why I think we're interested in these folkloric entities and these stories is that they somehow function as a type of like nearly like an interface or something between the person and the landscape. They're really like this liminal in between entity that's kind of is part of both worlds. And I think that there's a lot of potential in like thinking through these characters. So yeah, it will be interesting, I think.
Yeah, at the same time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really,
Thank you.
This is amazing. We go on actually now. Although we go on with a little break. All right, it's time to start. Yeah, welcome Isabel, welcome everyone else. And I will just start here again with introducing Isabel Lewis, a Berlin-based artist who was born in Santo Domingo and raised in Florida. She practiced the tools of literary criticism, which is also literacy, dance, and philosophy, and her work explores and also plays with many different forms and formats. So it ranges from lecture performances, which is something we will see today, workshops, music, parties, installations, and what she calls hosted occasions. And she creates alternative modes of sociality between human and also more than human agents. Her work is inherently collaborative. She has multiple long-standing collaborations, which, if you have read her letter, they are mentioned there, and it's really also this collaborative oeuvre has also the collective power to generate affective experiences that address all of the senses. So also smell and well, sound, the ears. She uses dance as a form of knowledge production to really get inside the body of different cultural value systems. And she created works around topics like open source technology and dance improvisation, social dances as cultural storage systems, rapping as embodied speech acts, collaborative creative formats, future bodily techniques, the body as multi-organismic assemblages, which are also based on the idea of biologist Lynn Margelius, who sees symbiosis as a driver of evolution, and the sociological concept of erotic sociability, based on the notion of erotic sociability, which she found in readings of the feminist sociologist Rosalind H. Bollow, which is with what we will work today. Hello, Isabel. So good to see you. Yeah, and I mean, she has been experienced around the world in many places. The list is long, too long to read it here, but yeah, Kunsthalle Zürich recently, Sharei Banal, Tate Modern, Serpentine Galleries, Palais de Tokyo. There's a lot. And also she's here now. And I just want to quickly still, say one thing. Oh yeah. Well, I actually just want to welcome you to the Erotic Sociability for Webcam and invite you, in Isabel's words, to dare and to experiment with and feel the potential of alternative forms of sociality in our interhumans interactions, as well as the kinds of relations we develop with our ecologies, in the digital in this case, because we need to change. And with this, I give it over to you, Isabel. Thanks so much for being here.
So today, I want to kind of bring you all into this world of what I call erotic sociability for webcam. What I was saying before is that it's lovely to kind of see your faces as I speak to you, if possible, if you're comfortable with that. And then there will be a moment where we will head into one-on-one breakout rooms. And then it's really important that as part of the exercise, you share your image with the other, because it's like this mutual interplay that we're going to be working with. So to speak about the title a little bit, Erotic Sociability for webcam, erotic sociability is a term that, a notion that I take from feminist sociologist Rosalind Bollow, who I had also the privilege of meeting a couple of years ago, but had for several years been walking around with her book and have read it like many times now. And this is the copy of it that I have, Love or Greatness. And one thing to note as I start to kind of unpack a little bit, or just introduce, I'll just spend a little bit of time like introducing this concept and where it's coming from for Rosalind Bollow. It was written it's first published in like 1990. So that's something to keep in mind, is that it still feels extremely contemporary to me, especially in her articulation of the essential nature of like separateness and difference as key elements of sociability, and how she articulates this, I find so sharp and kind of one of the best articulations of this kind of like intersubjective kinds of experience and like the ethics that go with that I have ever read. And yet there's other things that make the book feel a bit dated in certain ways, like her language around like gender and sexuality, for example. And she's oftentimes using terms masculine and feminine in this book. And I think she uses these particular terms to talk about qualitative aspects that sort of can belong to any gender. So I just want to like highlight that so that we're not getting like stuck on a certain awkwardness perhaps in relation to this like slightly dated language. So just keep in mind its historical context. It is like written in 1990 and still I feel like is so ahead of her time. And she's an incredible woman, a professor still teaching in New York. And yeah, very, very happy to share some of this and then move this into like from this kind of theoretical basis, like move into a physical exercise. Has everyone had a chance to download the breakout room music? Cool, great. So, so to speak about again, erotic sociability is a kind of alternative conception of social life as erotic sociability, an alternative rationality, which she says that is grounded in a female aesthetic sensibility, an alternative theoretical perspective that challenges both Marx and Weber and a whole way of thinking that makes our world. So the subtitles, Love or Greatness, Max Weber and Masculine Thinking, a Feminist Inquiry. So in it, she's really kind of painting a picture of the 20th century world as she sees it constructed somehow through the gaze, through the lens of Max Weber, Freud, and Marx. And she brings out erotic sociability as an alternative to what she identifies as these a value system that's really structured around conflict, coercion, and competition. So she's looking at this 20th century construction of a world that's based around this kind of heroic, masculine individual figure. And then she's working towards finding an alternative conception, like an alternative world. So in the last part of the book, she's trying to build up this notion of an alternative vision of the world and tries to establish, what would be the grounds for our interrelations that could really go beyond competition, coercion, and conflict. So she says, erotic sociability acknowledges that difference and separateness are essential to sociability, and difference and separateness often involve relations of conflict, struggles for liberation from domination and repression. And for me, that's important to note that she sees erotic sociability as a way of working on this struggle. It's not a solution to conflict and violence, the potential violence of being in relation with others. She's sort of saying there's always the danger of hurting another or being hurt when we're involved with one another. So she certainly doesn't propose that this alternative world is sort of without those conflicts, but that it's like an articulation of this struggle and of this mutual receptivity and the responsibility that we bear in the fact that we are mutually receptive to one another, that she's trying to sort of highlight and bring a language to. So I'm just going to read you the chapter titles and then a small section from the introduction of the book. So the contents of the book, part one of the book, she calls A World of Greatness. And with chapters, the introduction begins with Weber, Freud, and what she calls masculine thinking, which moves on into A World of Greatness, Strong Man, Conflict, Action, and Greatness, Men's World, Imperial Greatness. So here she's sort of establishing this idea of like kind of how she's reading the 20th century through the subject positions, which are generated in these kind of three thinkers' works, which she depicts as and calls this modern world, with the modern bureaucrat, modern hero, modern man, and modern God. Part 3, she starts to look at love in the conception of the 20th century picture. And she sees, and she calls this in chapters, brotherly love and practical action, brotherly love and revolution, brotherly love and culture, and erotic love as coercion. So in this section of the book, she's kind of speaking about, okay, how, if in a 20th century world, like greatness is somehow what is pursued in the public sphere through these heroic, conflictual, cutthroat means. And love is somehow relegated to the private sphere, and that private sphere is the domain of women and children or the infantilized. And she notes that somehow these positions remain fixed in this conception of a world. The public and private belong to these kind of gender distinctions, and they remain fixed in that way. So she's sort of looking at, but where is the place for love, or how is love thought about in this through the lens of these three thinkers? And she takes a long time to talk about Marx and his idea. What she describes is a form of brotherly love. So she says it's not that love is not present, but it's brotherly love. And what she means by brotherly love, like fraternity, is somehow also this idea of that requires a sameness. It requires a repression, actually, of difference, and it requires a denial of difference in order to bond the group. So it's really about like unifying under a single cause, under a single flag, under a single religion. It's really like that brotherly love can exist, but it's the danger to it is always people's differences. And then we head into part 4 of the book, which she calls an alternative world. And this is where she's really building out her vision of this alternative world. And she begins with erotic love as sociability, an alternative reality, a women's world, an alternative rationality, Marx and Weber, an alternative perspective. And finally, the book's title is Love or Greatness. So she's highlighting this choice that seems to need to be made in this 20th century world. In this future world that she's imagining at the end of the 20th century, writing this, is a world of what she calls love and greatness. And she really then highlights her alternative vision. And in her notion of love and greatness, both of those categories are kind of redefined, or they necessitate a kind of rethinking and redefining of these ideas, as well as a redefining and rethinking of public and private. And so now I'll just, in order to be concise so we can move on to the exercise, I will just read a little bit from her preface, which summarizes some of the chapters. So in chapter 1 suggests an important kinship between Weber's thought and Freud's, with the respect to the ideal of masculinity as renunciation and repression. Part 1 explores Weber's world of greatness, with chapter 2 introducing Max Weber's influence on contemporary political theory, political realism, exploring the patriarchal background of Weber's life, and suggesting a connection between masculine thinking and political thinking. Chapter 3 claims that the values of conflict, action, and greatness that inform Weber's notion of manliness account for the seeming paradox in his life and politics, the championing of both political liberalism and illiberalism. And she spends a lot of time looking at Weber's, like towards the end of his life, and the writings he's generating, and he's also somehow torn all the time between being like he sees this role of being like a man of action, sort of an active figure in the public social world, and a man of love, which what he sees is like a religious man, a man of religion, which is somehow to be like emasculated, this emasculated figure that's sort of thinking and studying, but is not politically effective as he sees it. And then he kind of plays out this dichotomy in some of his final works. Chapter 4 discloses an association of masculinity with a heroic ethic and femininity with an ethics of the subjugated. Also, the historical and patriarchal notions, the historical and patriarchal origins of the masculine political community and the public world. Chapter 5 continues Weber's analysis of the political community, exploring his theoretical and practical perspectives on imperialism and the link between manliness and liberal imperialism. Part 2 opens with Weber's critical analysis of both bureaucratic capitalism and ethical socialism. Both of them stifle heroic greatness. Chapter 7 probably best captures the spirit of Weber's thinking. It examines Weber's generally admired idea of the political actor and hero. A fear of worthlessness and possible dread of the body seem integral to this idea. So for Weber, it's always that the man of action has to renounce any kind of love, any kind of comfort, any kind of sort of the pleasures of the private, has to sort of renounce these things in order to become active and become a player somehow in the political sphere. Chapter 8 locates the irrationality at the heart of Weber's conception of rational action and shows how this irrationality accounts for the dilemma of modernity and the dilemma of modern man. Chapter 9 suggests that Weber's sociology of religion represents the defining tension of Weber's life and thought. Not only a debate with historical materialists, spiritual interests matter, and with ethical socialists and ethically and religiously oriented political activists, an argument that self-interest and desire for wealth and power operate. But a conflict between rationality and ecstasy. For Weber, religion represents the nagging and emasculating presence of sublimated desire, a feminine desire for love and ecstasy. And she puts that in quotes there, feminine. Part 3, beginning with chapter 10, recounts the tension Weber perceived between the man of action and the man of love. A tension that is played out in religion and in practical, political, and economic life. He shows how religious ethics of brotherly love ultimately repress practical action. Economic, political development. So what Weber sees as practical and effective rational action is this notion of progress at any cost, economic and political development. So while practical action must ultimately repress the ethics of brotherly love. So in Weber's conception, any display of love in the public sphere, which he has sharply defined as these two, as separate from the private sphere, any display of love would leave one sort of vulnerable to attack or vulnerable to sort of shows weakness, which then sort of hurts your chances of being successful in his vision, being an actor of political power. Chapter 11 attempts to refute Weber's thesis by recovering from his own historical scholarship the finding that an oath of brotherhood is crucial to the revolutionary development of the Occidental city-state and the history of the West. His own work reveals how a commitment to some brotherhood community, and equality, but of course not with women and others, has been critical to Western political and economic development. Chapter 12 examines Weber's thesis that adhering to a religious ethic of brotherly love would undermine cultural development. He considers not just art and intellect, but the dilemma of science and modernity. Chapter 13 addresses Weber's proto-feminist, she puts in parentheses, interpretation of the coercion and brutality at the heart of heterosexual erotic love, the imposition of the stronger will on the weaker. His work suggests that neither brotherly love nor erotic love can provide the basis for forming the world. So he kind of does go into a little bit thinking about erotic love, but in his vision of it, he cannot get past his own patriarchal vision of love, being that like erotic love can only mean the repression of the other's will, the domination of another's will. So he's in conflict with it. He doesn't know what to do with it. He sees that it's important for there's some desire in his writing for ecstasy, kind of through religion or like through this kind of erotic bond, but he's sort of unable to see any other way that erotic love could operate that is somehow ethical. He sees it as inherently a kind of brutality and a violence that is nonetheless somehow necessary. So he cannot think his way out of that like box somehow. Part 4 opens with chapter 14, which offers an alternative erotic love as sociability to Weber's patriarchal conception of erotic love as coercion. Sociability, so she brings theorist George Simmel into the book and his work on sociability, which he sees as the play form of human sociation, has implications not only for erotic love, but for all of social life. Pursuing the link forged earlier between gender and rationality, chapter 15 focuses on women's world to reveal an alternative female rationality, aesthetic rationality that is integral to sociability. So when she talks about like erotic sociability, she talks about eros as this like all of our kind of life-directed energies. And so she sort of opens it in this more expanded sense of, yes, including sex, but not only sex, not only thinking about sex, like really at its core, when she says erotic sociability, she's basically beginning her thinking and her theory writing about this notion from the body. So sort of acknowledging the fact that of affect, and that on the primary level, the way that we interact with one another in the world day to day is first and foremost on the level of the senses. And that to either greater or lesser pleasure, greater or lesser displeasure, but this is it's actually on the sensory bodily level that we're actually initially operating, rather than in this 20th century depiction of the world where it's this kind of abstract will, this disembodied will that's sort of fighting out in the world, and the denial of the body in order to support that will. This is sort of another conception that really begins from the body and from the senses. And that becomes the kind of the core place, like the sensory becomes a primary place of like understanding our mutuality and our interrelation with the other. Then she spends some time in chapter 17 addressing Weber's dichotomies. So there's always these same dichotomies come up time and time again in several of his works, of striving and surrender, action and contemplation, individualism and socialism, with which Weber confronts the world. These dichotomies correspond to a division between masculine greatness and feminine love. This division requires a decisive choice. In dissolving these dichotomies, the chapter that Bulo is working on suggests an alternative vision of social life that overcomes the opposition and transforms Weber's patriarchal conceptions of love and greatness. In this alternative vision, grounded in historical social change, the world orients to greatness not as patriarchal power and dominance over others, but as creative generativity. A world that fosters human greatness in the form of creative generativity requires human love, not in the patriarchal form of slavish devotion, but in the form of erotic sociability. So for her, that redefinition of power in this alternative vision of the world is the power to affect the other in positive ways. So she talks about this notion of creative generativity being that new conception of what could be power, rather than thinking of power as a domination of the other's will. And she then comes to this place of sort of human love, and this sort of mutual receptivity as the kind of basis for starting an ethical relation with another. Yeah, any questions at this point? Because I think we'll have time to sort of digest this as the exercise continues. But any thoughts or questions now before we move on into the exercise? Cool. Okay, there will be time also at the end. So I've thrown a lot at you, and yeah, somehow don't worry about it. It's like I'll you can get these texts that are excerpts from the book and have time to digest these things in your own time. But I wanted to just take some time to bring out this notion of, and what touched me so much about her notion of erotic sociability was exactly her articulation of that essential separateness and that essential difference, which is actually kind of that motor that drives our desire to connect. So it's curiosity, it's desire, it's pleasure related, it's life related, life force related. And I suppose, I mean, for me, growing up as a teenager in the 90s, what I can distinctly remember about sort of like the race discourse that was around at that time was about like tolerating difference, which is just one of the most ungenerous ways of stating that. It's just like how it's so incredibly rigid. It's as though, to tolerate is to sort of hold oneself back from violence. And this was kind of the slogans that were somehow everywhere in my growing up. This idea of tolerating difference, and then the other one was the other popular one was being colorblind. That was the other major slogan that was somehow everywhere. And this idea again of almost thinking like, okay, in order to have peace and harmony, we have to eliminate our differences or ignore our differences or pretend that they don't exist, which is just obviously, it hasn't worked, it never worked, and that will never work to bring about social transformation and social change. So I found it just so touching when I started to read the ways that she was really articulating difference as something that could be generative of something positive rather than something always problematic to only be repressed, which is of course how our modern bureaucratic lives operate, right? Everything is sort of categorized and standardized to like kind of facilitate the smooth functioning of our current societies. And for me, I feel it's upon us as creative souls, as artists, as teachers, as lovers, to try to envision what kinds of structures could operate with that essential difference, with honoring difference and honoring the nuance and particularity of people and situations. And of course, that's a whole hell of maybe a lot of work in some to sort of rethink all of like the categories that we live by, but nonetheless feels absolutely essential, because something about that, whatever is repressed when we go for these standardization processes, it leads always to sort of violent results. So these are things that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and this is sort of what, for me, when I'm kind of making my worlds inside of my artworks, inside of, like, for me, dance and using like the body as like primary mode of, as the primary technology for reimagining my world and assessing my world and then analyzing it and then creating new kinds of situations for that body to reside in and dwell in and inhabit in, are some of the very urgent things that really drive the kinds of situations that I'm creating. So with that, I'll let this sound continue behind my speaking. And I'll guide you through a series of exercises that mostly just follow my voice and instructions, and eventually it's going to start with the activation of the eyeballs and the movement of the eyeballs, and then we'll continue into the full body from there. So thinking about the eyes, like in my lecture, I talk about the ways in which Western modes of thought have been like embedded and embodied to dangerous effect in certain cases. And for me, one of those primary places is the eyes, how we have come to think about vision and how we use that vision. So I have this reflection I'd like to share with you from Donna Haraway in her book, excuse me, Simians, Cyborgs, and Women, The Reinvention of Nature, also from 1991. So the eyes have been used to signify a perverse capacity honed to perfection in the history of science, tied to militarism, capitalism, colonialism, to distance the knowing subject from everybody and everything in the interests of unfettered power. The instruments of visualization have compounded these meanings of disembodiment. The visualizing technologies are without apparent limit. The eye of any ordinary primate like us can be endlessly enhanced by sonography systems, magnetic resonance imaging, artificial intelligence-linked graphic manipulation systems, scanning electron microscopes, computer-aided tomography scanners, color enhancement techniques, satellite surveillance systems, home and office VDTs, cameras for every purpose, from filming the mucous membrane lining the gut cavity of a marine worm living in the vent gases on a fault between continental plates, to mapping a planetary hemisphere elsewhere in the solar system. Vision in this technological feast becomes unregulated gluttony. All perspective gives way to infinitely mobile vision, which no longer seems to just mythically be about the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere, but to have put the myth into ordinary practice. So of course, the eyes in the history of the West were not always associated with the hygienic cleanliness of distanced observation. A medieval people strongly believed in the idea of the evil eye, which of course was the idea that a curse or disease could actually be passed and transmitted through the gaze. Looking back to Aristotle in Parva Naturalia on dreams, Aristotle says that the organ of sight not only is acted upon by its object, but acts reciprocally upon it. So that if a woman looks into a highly polished mirror during the menstrual period, the surface of the mirror becomes clouded with a blood red color, which I found fascinating. I'm like, when did he really observe this, or was this hearsay, or maybe it really, like? But I love the idea. To me, it's incredibly like what an entirely different way of thinking about the eyeballs. That like actually we could leave, you know, that like bodily fluids could actually be transmitted other than tears, like through the eyes. So completely different conception of eyes as like sort of distant, hygienic, objective forms of observation. So with these thoughts in mind, please, I invite you to close your eyes for the moment. Most eyes have an anterior to posterior diameter of 24 millimeters, a volume of 6 cubic centimeters, and a mass of 7.5 grams, which is about the weight of a euro, which is about the weight of a 2 euro coin. The eye is not shaped like a perfect sphere. Rather, it is a fused two-piece unit composed of the anterior segment and the posterior segment. The front of the eye is made up of the corona. Sorry guys, you can tell what's on all of our minds right now. The front of the eye is made up of the cornea, the iris, and lens. The cornea is 1/5 of the eye, and the larger back portion of the eye, composed of the vitreous, retina, choroid, and the outer white shell called the sclera, is the remaining 5/6. Now, please roll your eyes around in their sockets behind your closed lids, just rolling them, feeling the range of their movement. These fine and precise movements of the eye are controlled by 6 muscles. They're called the lateral rectus, the medial rectus, the inferior rectus, the superior rectus, the inferior oblique, and the superior oblique. When the muscles exert different tensions, a torque is exerted on the globe that causes it to turn in almost pure rotation, with only about 1 millimeter of translation. The eye can be considered as rotating about a single point in the center of the eye. In this next moment, try to slowly open your eyes, as slow as possible, as though they were heavy velvet theater curtains being slowly lifted. Once you've opened your eyes, focus on a small point in space that is just immediately in front of your gaze. Take in as many details as possible. What is the texture and the color of this detail? Are you able to get a sense of depth or volume? Now close your eyes again and try to recreate this image in your mind's eye. Try to reconstruct this detail as sharply as you possibly can. And now open your eyes again, returning to that original point of focus. Observe how the image before you and the image you created from memory are similar, or how they are different. Which details were lost, added, or changed. keeping your eyes focused on this point in front of you, send your gaze beyond this point in space. So try to send your gaze to the space behind that original point of focus. You can use your imagination to enter the space beyond that held point of focus. Observe what happens to the image your eyes are directed toward. Perhaps it blurs or comes in or out of focus as you send your gaze beyond that point. So now try pulling your gaze back to that original detail that you first looked at and bring it back into full focus. And again, keeping now your eyes open and oriented towards that detail. Try to send your gaze inward, as though you could rotate your eyes 180 degrees to gaze at the space behind your own eyes. Try sending your gaze through your brain, through the skull, to the space behind your own head. Observe what happens to your vision whilst looking ahead and sending your gaze back. Pull your gaze back now to meet the image again in front of you, that original detail, that original point of focus. Now allow the eyes to rove and roam around the surface of your screen, of your device. If it's a computer, a phone, bring your face toward the device, actually moving your spine and torso forward to get close. Get close to your computer and try to pick up as many details as possible to the actual screen itself. So not looking into the depth of the zoom, but actually at the surface of your device. Noticing all the specks of dust, the smallest scratches, the dings and scrapes, the crumbs of food around or between the keys. Try to get a sense of the volume and the depths of these miniature objects of focus. You can also piece of dry skin, all the tiniest little details and smudges. See if you can even get a sense of the depth of the oil marks, oil smudges on your screen or on the keys. Looking at this tiny universe of details. And now bring your gaze back to the lens of the webcam or eyesight camera on your device. So again, not looking into it, but kind of trying to look at this device, the materiality of it. Get as close as possible, noticing the details of its design. Can you see beyond its slick surface? Can you see the depth between the different layers of the lens? Now continue roaming around the surface of your computer, But now change your focus from seeing to smelling. Does your computer smell like something? What does it smell like today? Are there different areas of smell that you can identify? And one thing I always try to do, one way to reset the nose is actually to smell your own skin. Try to just like smell yourself under your t-shirt or and then try smelling again and see if you can pick up anything at all. It might be entirely subtle, but you might register at least the difference between what your computer or device smells like and the smell underneath your shirt. Okay, now bring the eyes back into focus and focus on the webcam, pulling back from your computer. So again, taking a bit of space from the computer. And notice, in my case, it's this little green dot. Imagine that this gaze that captures your image is a form of touch.
A square meter.
Imagine it as a ray of focused, warm light that reaches out and touches your body like the tiniest spotlight or a beam of sunlight.
This return of dormant light suggests
You can try to offer different surfaces of your mouth and your face to this tiny spotlight, trying to get a sense of where it catches you. Tiniest, warmest ray of light, capturing and touching different surfaces. Feel the light as it crosses your jaw, your cheeks, your teeth, your tongue, your forehead, your eyelids. Now we can try to start engaging the rest of the body to offer other surfaces to be touched by this ray of light. So you might here want to, in my case, I'm going to move my chair to give myself some space. Again, just feeling this light as a form of touch and offering different surfaces of the body to be touched by this light. Tiniest details. You can experiment with proximity and distance in relation to this webcam. Offering your inner wrist, fingertips, elbow, collarbone, side of the rib cage. Continue in this way, becoming aware of this little dance you create while inviting the touch of the webcam to the surfaces of your body. These very beautiful dances I'm seeing. You can take a pause, and we're going to move on to the next step of this exercise, which will be into one-on-one breakout rooms. So I'll just explain the next moment, and then we'll go for it. So firstly, this workshop is based off of, I built it off of another work of mine, which is called Unambitious Stripper. And Unambitious Stripper is the work that I created, the first work that I created, kind of physicalizing some of these concepts and ideas. And for me, the figure of the unambitious stripper, so keyword unambitious, is what becomes this kind of very interesting moment. I use the reference of the striptease, not so much to talk about, the exhibition of the body or the display so much of the body, but on this one-to-one experience that actually is very, very much a moment of intersubjectivity. And in this kind of like dissolving and the nuance and complication that's happening inside of what it means to offer the surface of one's own body to host the gaze of another. So I see, a lot of my work is interested in different modes of hospitality and hosting, and I see this dance as a kind of giving of a gift, and a sort of hosting the gaze, inviting the gaze, and actually designing and composing the experience for the other. So this was for me what gets very interesting about what happens in the relation of one dancing for another, is this ability to compose and create a dramaturgy of experience, to actually have like sort of a beginning, middle, and end, to develop something. And that act of composition is very, it's very active, it's very powerful. And that really upends any notion of subjugation that maybe can be a discourse around this idea of like the sitting audience member or observer and the one who's performing for them or for their pleasure, but actually becomes like a much more complicated exercise when in this sort of active composition and the invitation of the gaze to one's surfaces, and that within the composing of that experience very intentionally and in an aware way. So what I propose for the next exercise is that we will be broken into one-to-one breakout rooms. You will, without taking too much time to discuss it, you'll be in the breakout for a total of 5 minutes. Once you're in there, one of you will decide to play the breakout room music and create a small experience, like in a similar way. Again, imagining the gaze as a form of touch. So now you have the webcam and you have sort of the representation of the gaze of the other. So things start to get really dynamic when you start playing to these different kinds of gazes. And the one who's viewing the dancer can also think about this activation of their gaze in all of these different ways that we also just exercised. So really looking through, looking beyond, looking inward while looking out. And so that you're in an active game of also composition of your own technology of vision, whilst the other creates a kind of 2-minute, call it what you will. You can call it a dance. You can call it if that is motivating, inspiring, but you can also call it something else, an exercise. If dance feels intimidating or like a block, it really is about again your own, let's say, your own experience of guiding these different mediated gazes and inviting them to the surfaces. of your body. So the breakout room music gives you the length of time because it begins and ends. It's 2 minutes long. So when you're finished with the 2 minutes, then it's time for the next, your partner to immediately offer the dance or the movement, the exercise, the other way around. And then the breakout rooms will automatically bring you back into the group session. So there's really a total of 5 minutes. So there's really not much time there's about 1 minute of time for like exchange, but we will have time when we come back to talk and to discuss and to have questions and to respond to one another. So is it clear? Is it seeming clear? Any questions before we go into the breakout rooms? Okay, great. Then give me 1 second to stop this particular music.
Can I say something? Can I ask something?
Yes.
Thank you so much first for this offer and for the work you're doing. It's very inspiring, and I wanted to talk a little bit maybe about the book. I haven't read all of it, but yeah, for what I can make, and the introduction that you made, it raises really so interesting questions. And first thing you said, yeah, that are kind of be aware that the discourse has changed, and it seems this one may be a bit inappropriate in some ways, or it so yeah, immediately I was like, how would you like to reformulate it, or how would you like to see that, to kind of update it to modern, say, sensibilities?
Yeah, such a
Maybe
good
that's
question.
first question.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and I think, I think I think just like our discourse around gender has expanded so much since the 90s, and somehow she's still like in the 90s. She is kind of working towards moving into some other conception. Like ultimately in the book, she arrives at like human, rather than kind of fixing her to gender. But I would, like, from my perspective, like it also lacks a little bit of like an intersectionality also. Let's say it's definitely, she is a white middle-class woman from the United States of America, and for me you feel that also in the book, in the discourse, and there isn't much discussion, like it's not very intersectional in the sense it's not really talking about, it's mostly talking along these gender lines of the male world and the female world, or men and women, but it's not in the scope of the book, let's say, for her.
I understand that you
class and race.
You said that, yeah, she uses these terms, or that is valuable in this context for us, that she uses these terms to denominate or articulate certain qualities. So I was wondering, how would you, and then there are a lot of well, first there is a kind of idea of polarization, and then second that these polarities, they exist on a lot of levels, some of which she notices in this book, for example, like active and receptive quality, or this kind of obvious things. But also I'm thinking also, and it's very interesting, the kind of wake centricity of our culture and society and civilization. Like it's, yeah, it's really all a dream, but there is a kind of really very strong assertion pressure that something is happening, or that waking state, and the way we kind of navigate this waking white world, I don't know, light also, like light country, and so on. And so because of fear of death, I guess, and maybe just a
Yes, I mean,
suggestion.
I think
So it has something to do with death, I guess.
yeah, I think it's interesting, like all the things you're bringing up. I think to me it brings to mind that it's a wonderful moment for us to kind of insist on also the creation of language and to define terms upon like the terms in the ways that we need to like use them in our actual contemporary lives. And like language is this like constantly changing and transforming thing. You know, in my case, like I'm able to read the text when I think about these qualitative features, what she calls masculine qualities and feminine qualities, and like what conventionally they are. But in some ways, I try to almost give those like textures or feelings rather than getting like kind of stuck in, you know, but is it then essentializing? And then like once you get like kind of stuck into these paths, like you're kind of unable to read, for me, what is actually her great work in this book, which is to really talk about that dance between the subject and the object as not fixed, as not gendered, as one is always at once a subject expressing themselves in the world, at the same time that they're an object of somebody else's interest or desire or curiosity. And at the same time, and the other can also draw out the subjectivity. And this is what, like, for example, Weber is not able to understand, that the subject can draw out the subjectivity of the other as well, draw them out of objecthood into subjecthood. So for me, this is the incredible articulation of the work that I want to like focus on when I bring it into this space.
Wow, thank you so much.
Yeah, but thank you. Any other thoughts or questions, reflections? Also open to just reflections on your experience.
Hi. Thank you so much for this, by the way. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about reconditioning the body, and through that sort of reimagining social structures and I guess like, yeah, deconstructing and reconstructing them.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to not be too lengthy here, because I think that this is like of something I'm kind of fascinated with. It's an endless space of research and discovery for me, and something I feel really strongly about. So I think that for me, this really begins with the rehabilitation of the senses. So, you know, there was a time sort of before the modernity project where we did not kind of divide up the senses in the way that we do, or like kind of specialization comes in that sort of corresponds with each of those kind of like chopped up sensory. And of course, in other cultures, you have highly different ways of expressing the senses and sensory reception. So for me, this is like a real starting place, is like really like literally exercising our sense of smell, literally exercising our listening, literally like bringing into check the power of the dominance of the visual, which is somehow so massively overemphasized in our culture. And I think that there's not really, you know, we're born into this. We're completely created as subjects by this fact in some ways. That's how I feel. And then I feel that then my only way to deal with it is to kind of amplify my other senses, to be in a kind of a daily practice of insisting upon honing those other senses, to kind of bring that in, bring the power of that I give to the eyes, like to bring it into check with the other senses, and I mistrust the visual very much. And a lot of days, like I don't see well, actually. And there's days like today, I was also walking through the city for an hour without my glasses on, and I've been doing that a lot lately because I mistrust these eyes. I mistrust them totally. I mistrust the way they've been educated to see the world. And nonetheless, I also think it's possible to kind of recreate new habits around how we use our eyes and how can we like humanize them. And for me, that really does like sometimes start with very pragmatic exercises like what we were doing today, like literally just getting in touch with those muscles, these very practical, pragmatic bodily exercises that I think, kind of in bringing that visual sense into check can transform the way that we actually operate and interact with the world. Thank you for your question.
I would love to ask about, well, thank you so much, first of all. I think what really resonated with me is how also you talk about practices of conditioning and deconditioning rather than individual transformative instances, though of course those are sometimes, and there is ever so much craft in that, and also in this workshop your skill as a guide holding such a space. But how do we ourselves hone these practices and thus make sense of the world around us actively with that? I'm just wondering how do you see what would be for you if you could choose, regardless of what the current bounds are? How could that happen in a situation right now when a lot of us are experiencing isolation on so many levels, and the boundaries between what we experience as virtual and what we experience, or at least substantial and insubstantial, are hard to make sense of. So how does one navigate through this space right now, which is for the time being, for sure?
Yeah, thanks for your question and kind of reminding me and us, because it's I think we're in a really weird moment. I think there's going to be a lot of, this is going deep. Like it's my dreams are already affected, as maybe many of yours are. Like in my dreams, I'm aware that it's like I see people touch, and I'm aware that it's a corona moment in my dreams. So I think it's gone in really deep. I think it's a level of trauma that I think is gonna have some lasting effects that I think are hard to understand what they are at the moment and what they will be. But I also, what I wrote down as you were speaking was sensualizing things. Like I realized that I have all the ways that I used to explore this idea in clubs, a lot of times on the dance floor, a lot of times, all of these places where I was exploring and learning everything that I now put into such a workshop as today, that is coming from like real life lived experiences that happened in the world in relation to other people physically. I think the thing that I'm really tuning into these like micro materialities. So, this exercise of like looking at at all the little specks and things, like really getting intimate with these objects, which seem as though, they perform this kind of slickness and they perform this hygienicness, but nothing is, everything is in its state of decomposition and decay, and that is actually the thing that maybe bonds all things. And I think like getting sort of fascinated or interested more deeply in these like processes of transformation and the different rates of change that they have is something that for me is like suddenly I'm finding sensuality, or like I'm finding like a greater experience of sensuality when I look at a painting or when I read a text, and then I try to push, like in my own exercises of sort of writing and thinking, like I try to find ways of like pushing my language towards the sensual, like so really like exercising, sensualizing. I feel like I don't really know what it means, but I feel like what it means for me is a kind of hyper attunement actually to my immediate surroundings, and even those surroundings have radically, like, let's say that the scale of them, the breadth of them, the distances of them have radically reduced, I'm kind of like discovering mini universes inside of mini universes inside of mini universes. It's reminding me that it's just like the complexity goes all the way down. There is no starting point of metaphysics. I like Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead calls it like an actual occasion is a unit of reality. An actual occasion meaning like all the things that I can be sensate of or aware of in relation to one another. So all of these like relations and just becoming like hyper attuned to them, where then I see like, wow, inside of each of these micro worlds is just like another whole universe. So just remembering in a way that complexity goes in all directions, that scale is this very bizarre thing. And I think my sense of scale and I have a hard time articulating it because it's being like radically reformed at this moment. So I hope that like somehow maybe, thank you. Other thoughts or questions now?
I've got one, Isabel. First of all, thank you so much for such a tactile and attuned activity. I enjoyed it very much. I was wondering, in these kind of experiments and negotiations between subject and object, what implication does that have on, like power play in BDSM and other kinds of eroticized activities that are conscious and intentional?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because it's somehow about, I sense in it a kind of, it's playfulness, it's about playfulness and consent, this kind of like role switching and this sort of active, communication of one's desire or curiosity. So I actually see this as like fitting in quite well, like while it can have a very soft expression in terms of play, I think it can also have another kind of physicality that relates to it, and I see it actually as operating, from a distance. It's not something that I personally explore, but it's things I've certainly observed a lot in my lifetime of like being in clubs and BDSM clubs, more as like a voyeur than a participant. But I think what seems very activated there is that the codes of sociality, that it is coded, and that code is to be respected, and that you can call it a code, you call it a choreography, and that there's a trust building that's inside of that, and that trust, that relation of trust inside of that codedness of what is that specific form of sociality is really important, because it's like once that breaks down, then the whole thing kind of breaks down. So I actually see it as quite a good example of a place to actually practice exactly this, let's say dance, between this continuum of subjectivity and objectivity.
Could I reflect just a little bit on that? That makes me think that, on one hand, there are rules that create a safe container. It's very clear, but on the other hand, and there is a kind of vivacity invoked, maybe, but a lot of intensities that are tapped into come from collective trauma heals. Really, so embedded in kind of patriarchy and capitalism. Everybody carries around this trauma, and it is also a way to the mechanism for it to perpetuate itself, because actually it is like I'm offering it's not I'm not saying this is the case. It's a kind of just a thinking process, right? That I'm sharing. I'm not saying like something is in a certain way. Would never assert that, but yeah, that it makes people perform this same power relationships because in them there are pain and pleasure kind of mixed. So that's why it is exciting and so on. And yeah, it relates to trauma and to collective trauma and to collective things. And when you were talking about the book, you mentioned, yeah, well, it seems that perspective of the author of Bolo, that it is in a way a little bit exclusive in how it addresses trauma, because it says, yeah, it's also fucked up and in this model kind of, and also not true and kind of miserable situation in a way. So yeah, an alternative reality is like you can be nice to people because it's nice, but then it's kind of again negation of this pain of relating, negation of trauma, and this feeling of this pain is what allows any kind of depth. I guess I don't know, because it's still there's so much carried in everybody. So yeah, and the social kind of world operates in a way that it's kind of smoothed out, and yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's I have no idea what I'm talking about. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but it brings up for me many interesting things. I have to think about like Audre Lorde and how she talks also about pleasure and politics and how to kind of use it, and it brings to mind like healing, or how deeply invested like social transformation, like the idea of social transformation needs to be like really deeply invested in healing practices. And this is to me again where we can maybe return to this like rehabilitation of senses, and healing doesn't have to look a certain way, it doesn't have to feel a certain way, it doesn't have to like avoid, you know, if this like 20th century world that Bolo's describing like avoids comfort and pleasure, we don't have to now then avoid pain, we need to kind of go through it.
Because that's what creates it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I hear what you're saying as like,
yeah, and healing,
you know, the coin flip of the repetition of these inequities,
cycles of violence.
Yeah, exactly. And that for me is about like finding a way to actually think and practice outside of dichotomies. Because if we cannot think and practice outside of just on a conceptual, like formal level, if we cannot think outside of these dichotomies and move and practice outside of them, then we can only ever just like flip the coin. So it's like very much about like cultivating ways of practicing and ways of thinking that supersede or go beyond, stretch beyond dichotomous.
In a way, we'll be still flipping the coin as long as we would be performing subjects. Yeah, we don't need to take it as something necessary to do, and we also actually we don't need to build a sociality based on this. And yeah, in the book already, and she's talking about how we bring each other into existence as selves. Yeah, and this is just us passing it on. It happens in infancy, in the first, in relation with the mother, or like first significant caretaker. But we are always a kind of crystallization point of a flux of very different agencies, but it's in a way delusional to think that there is somebody there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting what you say about like the subject a fixed notion of subjecthood. You know, for Bullo, she doesn't describe it as a dance, but I do, because it has this like movement. It's a movement. It's not a fixed, and you know, and I think then we could also maybe think of this word intersubjectivity as like a helpful maybe word to think about what that is. That basically are the core, the key problem that she too identifies is this fixed notions of subjectivity and objectivity.
Perhaps that supposes a kind of vision.
Sorry, I just want to kind of bring it's we're now well over time, and so I don't want to I feel a responsibility to also say, hey, it's thank you. It's been a long session, but I'm definitely also, I'm not sure, Karina, how is it? You're the host here. If you can, if we want to leave it open for people's continued conversation. I myself also have to depart because my partner is waking from dental surgery, and I need to go into nurse duty right now.
I think we can continue any conversations in the Discord anytime. So I posted that into the chat, so you can just move there and continue this conversation as long as you want. I really warmly invite you to do that. That's what it's there for. And then, yes, Isabel, thank you so much. Also thanking so much for the time and for giving us, I think actually really practical tools. Like there's so much talking in a way, and I really find this like changing of the signifiers and like this idea of really, making difference desirable. It's such a good tool actually to think. I mean, like, it's very like a model to think with.
Thanks so much. Well, everyone, stay healthy.
Bye bye.